Welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Tock, Director of Future Ed, and it's my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's webinar on the changing school choice landscape. As many of you know, there are many types of school choice. Families move into communities for the schools or pay for private or parochial schooling. There's homeschooling. Magnet schools and charter schools draw students from throughout public school systems. School systems with open enrollment permit students to attend any age-appropriate school within their borders. Beginning in Milwaukee in 1990, low-income and other targeted groups of public school students have been able to use state funding for private schools, and today 32 states provide an estimated $4 billion in subsidies to some 690,000 students through tuition vouchers, education savings accounts, and tax credit scholarships. But recently, public funding of private education has surged. This year alone, lawmakers in at least 42 states have proposed legislation to create or expand tax-funded programs to help parents cover the cost of private schooling, and 6 states have passed laws creating universal education savings accounts that permit any or nearly any student to use public monies to buy private schooling. We're fortunate to have an expert panel to help us explore these trends and their consequences for students, families, schools, and taxpayers. Breanne Davis is a Republican Arkansas state senator and lead sponsor of the 2023 Arkansas Learns Act, which raised starting teacher salaries, nearly 40%, and creates a phased-in, universal, state-funded private school choice program. Patricia Levesque is Chief Executive of the Foundation for Excellence in Education, better known to many as Excel in Ed, a national policy organization. She served as Deputy Chief of Staff to former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Doug Harris is Chair of the Economics Department at Tulane University and Director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans and the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice. And Liz Cohen is Future Ed's Policy Director and co-author with Bella DeMarco of the recent Future Ed report titled The New Wave of Public Funding of Private Schooling Explained. We'll have the panel share their insights for the first portion of the webinar, and then we'll get to as many audience questions as we can via Zoom's Q&A function. So, Senator Davis, thank you very much for joining us from a hospital where your daughter has just had her tonsils out. Very generous of you to take time to do this with us, and we wish her the best. So let's start with you. Can you give us the contours of the private school choice provision in the Learns Act and explain why you believe public monies should support private schooling?
Sure. Well, in Arkansas, I feel like we did our universal school choice in a really responsible and methodical way. We phase it in over 3 years. So we currently in Arkansas have what is called the Succeed Scholarship, and that's for students with low income and with disabilities. And so next year we will start, they'll all phase into our education freedom accounts, and we'll include students who are homeless, former or current foster students, and a few other, all kids starting kindergarten. And we cap that at 1.5% of prior year's student totals. So that's around 7,000 students for the state of Arkansas. In year 2, we expanded a little bit. We include first responders, law enforcement, National Guard, things like that. And we cap it at 3%. So approximately 14,000 students in year 2. And then in year 3, it goes to universal. And so we have metrics in place to ensure that we administer the program in an efficient and effective way, which was sort of our way of saying, like, assuming worst case scenario in terms of budget, if every single student in the state tried to apply for an education freedom account, obviously that couldn't happen with our state budget. So like I said, I feel like we phased it in a responsible, measured way. And it's important because here in Arkansas, we rank almost last in education in our state. Only around 35% of our third graders are reading at or above grade level. And that statistic doesn't change when you look at students who are then in 10th grade. They're still reading at about the same level, the percentage wise, and they're just not catching up. And we know that what that means for students' future. And so with Learns, while the education freedom accounts get a lot of attention, and rightfully so, empowering parents to make choices for their kids to meet their educational needs. There's also a lot of other pages in that bill that do a lot of things for public schools. And so I continue to say that Learns is overwhelmingly a public school bill. We put over $250 million new dollars into public schools, and that does not account for the additional increase in foundation funding, which was the second largest increase in our state's history. So there's a lot going on with private schools to continue to support those and pour new resources and money into our public schools, but then also support students in making a choice for their kids and their education.
Great, thank you very much. Patricia, let me ask you why Excel in Ed has been supportive of the universal private school choice initiatives that have emerged this year. Your organization has worked on this front for some time.
Sure. Well, Tom, thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting this panel on a really important topic. Excel in Ed's mission is to change policy to help each and every student achieve their full potential. And so part of the policy that we think is important to help students reach their full potential is giving families access to the education systems and services that will best meet the needs of each student. Every student is unique. Every student may have different needs. And so while, just like Senator Davis talked about, the Arkansas Learns bill was primarily a public school, a strengthening public school bill, a lot of the work that Excel in Ed does, the vast majority, is on how do we help the current public school system? How do we ensure all kids can read by the end of grade 3? How do we make sure funding is equitable? How do we make sure there's strong college and career pathways? But as part of our mission, you can't ignore the fact students are different, families have unique needs, and families need to be given access to opportunities for education systems that will meet their child's individual needs.
Great, thank you. Liz, what's your analysis based on the research that you and Bella did of why we're seeing a surge at the state level in the universal private school choice initiatives?
Well, okay, so maybe it's the $1 million question. Why does people want it in certain states? I mean, I think one argument is that it's a reflection of the increasing polarization we're seeing. It's happening mostly in Republican-led states. Pew Research Center did a survey in the fall where 61% of Republicans said that they feel like public schools are having a negative effect on the United States, whereas 72% of Democrats said they feel like public schools are having a positive effect. So if you live in a place where a lot of people feel like public schools aren't doing good things, like maybe as a governor or state legislators, you feel like this is what people want. I think that there's an argument. I mean, some people say, like, look, certain people have been pushing for private school choice for a long time, and we've had private school choice since almost, the beginning of public education in America in certain places, like way back to tiny programs in Vermont over 100 years ago. So it's always kind of been around. And then I think there's the thing about like what COVID did in terms of like, did COVID kind of change the relationship between families and schools and make people think differently about different kinds of options?
Yeah. Thanks. Patricia, anything to add on that from your perspective?
I think what Liz said at the very end, the pandemic changed the relationship between parents and schools. And for a lot of families, either because they were, as my child was sitting right next to me at the kitchen table, getting online instruction, and a lot of other families experienced that emergency online schooling. The relationship changed. And not only did parents get greater visibility into what and how their child was learning, but they also, I got to tell you, I appreciated the quality time with my kids, right? I appreciated that slower pace, that ability to have more input and interaction. And because of that, I think a lot of families experimented and chose other things. And then policymakers continued to hear from parents who wanted other opportunities. So I think the pandemic was a really was a catalyst for the big changes that you're seeing now.
Thank you. Liz, describe for us the differences that you see, that you found in the current crop of universal education savings accounts in 7 or 8 states this year, and the earlier private school choice initiative going back to Milwaukee's voucher program that launched in 1990.
So I think the big difference is that those original voucher programs in Milwaukee and then in DC were very small and targeted. They were really designed specifically for students in poorly performing, underperforming schools. And so the big difference now is this move towards universal programs. And some states, like Senator Davis was saying in Arkansas, are taking a phased in approach. I think Iowa also. And then some states like Arizona have just gone full universal right now, meaning that anyone from any school, like you could be attending the top performing school, you could also have never attended public school. You could already be homeschooled or in private school, and you could qualify to participate. So I think that that's really the big shift, is the move towards universality, which also, there's a lot of conflicting research. Some research says voucher programs do good things, and there's other research that shows that voucher programs haven't done good things. But all of that research has really been done on these kind of small targeted programs. So we really have almost no research base also to instruct us on what we can expect.
All right, fair enough. So Doug, you know the research on school choices as well as anyone, and because you and your colleagues have done a lot of it, a lot of the best research. Is there, in fact, research evidence on student achievement and other metrics that recommends private school choice programs? Again, going all the way back to the nation's first voucher program in Milwaukee that launched in 1990.
Yeah, there is a lot of evidence, and I'll break it up just to keep it short into 2 categories. There's the older small scale studies, I think that Liz was talking about in Milwaukee and DC and some others that are more targeted to urban areas and to lower income disadvantaged populations. Also instituted at a time when we didn't have charter schools for the most part, that this was kind of before that. And so the context was pretty different. And we've had a lot of other kinds of school reform in the meantime that have been designed to and have seemed to improve public schools in the meantime. So whenever you're comparing the voucher schools to traditional public schools, you got to think about what's happening in that comparison group. So in those small scale programs, the results were very modestly positive on average, but I just don't think they're all that relevant because the context is so different now, and because those were targeted programs to urban areas, and the universal programs are not targeted, so they're not. It's just not all that informative. There are 4 statewide programs that get us a lot closer to the current kinds of policies that are being put in place. So Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, and Florida. So 3 of the 4 cases, the evidence suggests negative effects of test scores, which is really unusual. I don't usually see negative effects. So that's unusual. In Louisiana, where I think the results are probably most convincing because students were actually randomly assigned to the vouchers, there's also no effect on college going. The Florida case is a little bit different. So there, the results are more positive, but also less convincing because you have this selection bias problem that we always worry about as researchers, that it's hard to compare the students in the Florida studies who used the voucher to those who didn't use the voucher. And the testing requirements in Florida don't really allow you to compare the scores of the students in the private schools using vouchers to the students in traditional public schools. So so more positive, but it's harder to interpret. So overall, the closer we get to the programs that are being instituted now, the worse the results look. And I think that's a bit of a concern for going forward, and the idea that if we're motivating this based on low test scores in Arkansas and other states, that it doesn't give us a lot of hope that this is going to be helpful.
Interesting. So just very briefly describe the selection bias problem that you alluded to.
Well, so if you think about it, just outside the voucher context, who goes to private schools? It's not a random subset of the population that goes to private schools. So outcomes in private schools tend to be better. More kids go to college, graduate from high school, and so on. But they're coming from families who are wealthier and have more advantages, and so on, who are able to afford private schools and have the motivation to send their kids to private schools. So they do better. But it's not because the private schools necessarily did anything to help that. It's just that they're coming with resources and family resources that allow them to succeed. And so we have the same problem with the voucher program. If somebody uses a voucher, then how do we compare that to these other groups?
Tom, I've
Yeah.
got to jump in here to just
Sure.
say that the largest program in the country is the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program that's targeted for low-income students. So 100 to 120,000 students that are in that program. Their average family income was $25,000 a year, which was much lower income than the average low-income students that they were being compared to in the public school system. So the largest program in the country that did show every year for years equal to or greater growth in reading or math than like-kind students in the public school system. And it was a comparable look at their performance because Florida embedded norm reference test questions into the state assessment. So you could compare norm referenced performance compared to other students in the private school system that were taking these tax credit scholarship programs. I don't know that your audience wants to hear about the details of the different research pieces, because I'd be happy to talk about the fundamental flaws in the design of the Louisiana private school choice program that only really incentivized the weakest potentially private schools from participating, because there was so many restrictions put on the private schools. Less than a third of private schools even chose to participate in the program. I think what's really important, and the question that should be asked, is why should we fund students instead of systems? And I think that's what private school choice or universal ESAs does, is it shifts to funding students instead of funding systems. America has done this funding systems for decades, and these states that are taking steps toward funding students, it's a really important step forward, because now families are more in the driver's seat of figuring out what works best for their child.
So just to clarify a couple of points, I think the comparability point in Florida, you're not comparing the private school students who are taking this norm reference test aren't being compared to any reasonable comparison group. It's not because the researchers did anything wrong. It's just because the study was designed in a way, the program was designed in a way that you couldn't. So there's no way to make the comparison, unfortunately. On the Louisiana case, I mean, I think the flaws that you're talking about are the idea that students take a test that's comparable. It's the same test as in the public schools. There actually weren't very many requirements. It's just that private schools don't want to have rules, and they want to operate the way they normally operate and not have accountability. And so that's why some didn't participate, and some wouldn't have participated anyway, because the kinds of the students who were eligible for the program, they probably wouldn't have served them anyway.
So let's come back to the transparency and accountability points. Thank you both for your perspectives on that piece. Doug, I want to ask you how you think about the fact that many students participating in the universal program so far, and I'm thinking primarily of Arizona here, were already in private schools, or to a lesser extent, young children starting schooling for the first time, formal schooling for the first time. How are we supposed to think about that in using public monies for private schooling? In other words, what do you see, and I hope others jump in on this too, as the rationale for spending money on private schooling in an environment like that? That is where many of the families are already.
Yeah.
in the
I
private
mean,
sector.
when you put a program like this in place, where you're giving money for private schools, the money's going to at the beginning, especially, the money's going to go to people who already have their kids in private schools. So it's not surprising that at least initially, the vast majority of the money will go to that group, to the already fairly well-off families who send their kids to private schools. And then I think the hope is, and I'm sure the other panelists will talk about how the hope is to get more students to leave public schools, and that then you start bringing in more students, in kindergarten and other grades who will exit public schools to go to private schools.
All right. Thoughts on that, Patricia?
I go back to, I think a strong policy goal is to fund students versus systems. Let parents figure out what is the best educational system or service or program for their child. And so I don't think the goal of any of these programs is to get people out of the public system. It's how do you do both? How do you fund and support the public school systems as well as giving families a choice and let families decide? In a lot of polling that has been done lately, it's actually really overwhelming that parents want to choose, and they're really agnostic, right? Like these debates that we have on this system versus that system, parents just want a good school for their child. Parents want a safe school for their child. Parents want a school where their child comes home and is engaged and is and excited and energized and loves to go to school. And so creating more opportunities for that is a good thing. Creating those opportunities typically for less than what the state or the public system would be paying were the systems in the students in the public system is a good thing. So I think the question that's really important is who's in the driver's seat on education, right? And it should be that families have a say in picking out and figuring out what works best for their child.
Okay. Doug, one more for you. Most private schools are in a position to select students. They are allowed to select their students. Does research, whereas the public schools in most instances don't, is there research that suggests a consequence of that fact on who goes to private schools with public support?
Yes and no. So I think we actually have some evidence on this. I think the way to think about it is that you tend to get the more advantaged of whatever the eligible group is. So Patricia was talking earlier about how the students in the Florida program come from low-income families, which is absolutely true. So the comparison group then in that case is, well, other low-income students in the public school. So what you tend to get are the more advantaged of the group. So if it's a relatively disadvantaged group, you're just tend to get students who are a little bit on the more advantaged than whatever that group is. So if it's a universal voucher program, it's going to be, again, tend to be more advantaged families. Part of the issue here is that when we think about school choice, I think Patricia's talking about it from the parent standpoint, that the parents are able to choose. But the flip side of this is that schools also get to choose. And this is your point about selection. So schools get to choose who comes in. They can select on almost any basis, or they can pick on the basis of religion, gender, or gender identity, academic background, prior behavioral issues, income. Indirectly, they could choose on the basis of race, even though that's not technically legal. So and schools really value those requirements. In fact, in the work that's been done on why some private schools don't participate, the number one reason they give is that they don't want to give up having their admission requirements.
Interesting. All right, thank you. Senator, what will success look like under the Arkansas Children's Educational Freedom Account program, and how should it be measured? And there's a question in the chat that I'll ask you relatedly, since you're going to share your thoughts with us on these other things. If in the first 2 years of the Arkansas program, schools or the program is oversubscribed, is there a lottery? How does that work?
So there won't be a lottery. We anticipate to do like prorated amounts. So right now it's 90% of prior year student funding. This year's student funding is $7,413, so 90% of that. And so we anticipate if it is full, if there's over 7,000 applicants, then we'll do a prorated system, but not a lottery system. Success, I think success looks a lot of different ways. One thing that our education secretary, Jacob Oliva, says repeatedly, him and the governor have been doing Learns town halls across the state, and I've been moderating most of those. And one thing that he says that I love is that we know that even with the universal voucher program, that students and families will overwhelmingly continue to choose their local public schools. And we want our local public schools to be the best schools in communities across our state. And so to me, success looks like we're giving parents and families an option to find something different for their kids that meets their students' educational needs. We know, we've already said, not all students are the same. They all learn differently and need different things. But I think success also looks through Learns, and hopefully because of the education freedom accounts, because of competition, that it looks like we have more students across our state reading at grade level. It means that our public schools start performing better because we are tuning in to data where maybe we haven't been making data-driven decisions before. So when you look at all the other parts of Learns, apart from the education freedom accounts, then you see a big investment in our public schools. And I don't think that it's one thing alone that changes the face of education in Arkansas. I think it's all the different pieces of Learns that invest in students in public school, invest in students in private schools, charter schools, home schools, whatever it may be, that make this successful. And there's one great success story, I think, and it's with a school in Little Rock called Easter Seals, and they serve students with disabilities. And in 2019, they planning to close their doors. They had somewhere between 21 and 23 students, not enough to stay open. And around that time, we passed the Succeed Scholarship for students with disabilities. And today, that school has 70 kids. 56 of them are on the Succeed Scholarship, and they have a waiting list of 150 students. And what that says to me is that there was a need, but there were families that didn't have the money to pay for that need. And so now with the Succeed Scholarship, which will be the education freedom accounts, we're going to have the ability to have students with disabilities go to a school that they feel like meets their educational needs, and their families are going to be able to pay for it because of the education freedom accounts. And that to me is a great success story.
Great. So how does the New Arkansas program help students and families make informed judgments about the best private school options for their children? How do they find that school that offers the right program, the right teaching style?
Well, I think much like we do today when people are looking at which schools to send their kids to, parents have I think a job or responsibility there to do a little bit of research on where they're going to send their kids to school. I know the Arkansas Department of Ed is going to have a comprehensive list of all private schools that are choosing to be part of education freedom accounts. And one thing that we have in the bill is a little bit of accountability. And I've heard a little talk of it today on this panel, but with year-end testing. So any student that takes part in the EFAs will have to be required to take a year-end test in private schools and homeschool. And then there's also some monetary things in there where they will have to have an annual audit to ensure that funds are being spent correctly. And so it's like I told the superintendents across our state, it may not be the exact accountability that you want, but it is accountability. We do have some metrics in there, and that will be public information, specifically the year-end testing. So if you're looking at a specific private school, you can go online and see how other students who are part of the EFAs are scoring, generally speaking, on year-end assessments.
And what happens, thank you, what happens when it's determined a couple of years down the road that private school X or Y is not educating kids effectively, or that they are not using public monies appropriately?
If they're not using public money appropriately, we do have some of that written into the bill, and they will be essentially banned from the EFA program. So we really take into account bad actors and say, hey, if you're a homeschool parent and you're spending money inappropriately, if you're a private school spending money inappropriately, then you will no longer be able to be part of this program. We are going to take that very seriously. And then as far as academic wise and how they're performing, there are already standards in place. We already have a board that deals with private schools and charter schools in our state. And so there are accountability metrics through that and through their licensing and ability to operate as a private school. And so we anticipate that that will still be taken care of through that board.
Thanks. So is it the State Department of Education that's the agency that ensures both the fiscal and academic integrity of these programs?
Yes, that will be housed under the, well, yes and no, as far as the testing and the audits, the annual audits, but that separate board will be looking at the how they're doing academically and all their licensing requirements.
Got it. Thanks. Liz, how well do the new programs in other states do these sorts of things? That is, help parents navigate their choices, ensure on behalf of taxpayers that the program offerings are of sufficient quality and have financial integrity?
The shorter answer is we don't know right now a lot of the mechanics. In terms of the accountability piece, in addition to Arkansas, Iowa, and Florida, as Patricia mentioned, are other states that are requiring tests. So I think we hope that that kind of information is sort of part of the conversation and is provided to parents in the way that Senator Davis says, they're planning to do in Arkansas. I think, I think it's a big open question. I think it's also, in a way, like it opens a door to probably maybe an even more important question, which is that there's some data out there that suggests that parents don't have a good read on how their kids are actually doing, right? The nonprofit Learning Heroes did a survey last year. Something like 90% of parents in a nationally representative survey said that they believe their child is at or above grade level on reading or math. But when you look at any test scores, we know that that's just not true. So I think there's like an interesting conversation to be had generally about what are the kinds of information that parents at any kind of school need to be equipped with. And I think that could be, a way into kind of thinking more broadly about parent engagement and accountability, both on these private school programs and as well as public school programs.
Right.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, look, I think we've heard, right? Like supporters would say there are lots of kids that are in low quality public schools anyways. And there's not like a great support network with that. And I think others would say, people who oppose these programs, I think generally would say, look, we're trying to fix these schools. And so splintering off funds and kids isn't helping us in our work. And I think that's kind of the tension. But, I think for those of us who have spent a lot of our careers working on sort of evidence-based strategies, like this idea of let's put the information out there and talk about what that information is and make sure that it's accessible to parents is going to be a really important part of it. And we just don't know yet exactly how states are planning on doing that in the new programs.
All right. Arizona, however, does not, my understanding, require testing. So there's less transparency, both for families less support for families trying to navigate choices effectively. On the one hand, and then taxpayers are perhaps not as well protected on the other, right? And the other thought I had in response to what you're saying is that it's not, we don't want to replace mediocre schools with mediocre schools, right? The notion is that parents are making choices in the private sector that serve their students better than where they or how they have been served in the public sector. So
I agree. So if that's the theory of change, right? If that's like our theory of action of how these things work, is that parents are going to be able to make the best choice. And if a parent sees their kid isn't learning, they would want to pull their kids from that school and either re-enroll them in public schools or find a different private school. So then I think that's where, like, I think we should have a push in all of these programs for some amount of transparency and information so that parents can in fact make those decisions. I don't know exactly how in Arizona they want parents to make decisions if they're not planning on putting out that kind of information or collecting that information. Whereas, I mean, based on what Senator Davis says, it seems like maybe Arkansas is thinking about that in a proactive way.
Right. So Doug, what's your take? How much transparency and accountability should there be, and of what sort? And you're speaking from a perspective of a researcher who's trying to understand the system and ensure the public policy goal is met here.
Well, from a research standpoint, there's a little bit of research on the effects of voucher accountability, and that evidence suggests that it does improve the way in which voucher programs function. Not a lot, and some of it's fairly old, so it's not clear how much that applies here. But I do want to point out more generally that we're basically creating two very different kinds of systems here. The private school voucher system is going to have much weaker accountability than traditional public schools are.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, there's just not that much information. So they're having to take a test, but the test isn't going to be comparable to the public school test that students are taking. So it's going to be hard to make that comparison. For that reason, we'll probably never know whether, in the same sense we have this problem in the Florida analyses, that we'll probably never know whether these programs were effective in raising reading and math and other basic skills, because they're designed in ways that you really can't figure that out. Providing information is good. Having a test is better than no test, and making that information available to the public's good. My sense from what the senator said is that there's probably not going to be much accountability for academic performance. It sounds like it's more on the financial end of things. So, for example, in Louisiana, when students don't do well, the voucher schools are on the same accountability framework, the same letter grades as traditional public schools are. And if students are doing poorly, then the schools can't accept students anymore, right? So that would be a pretty basic thing that you could put in place to have some accountability and make sure that students are actually learning and not ending up in schools where they're not improving those basic skills.
Right. So Patricia, I'd love to get your take on this question of how much transparency and accountability is appropriate, and of what sort. ExcelenEd is, of course, a strong advocate of test-based transparency and accountability in the public sector.
Sure. I think the one thing that's really important is to talk about what kind of accountability do you want, and not all accountability is the same. I do believe that parents having the ability to choose is the ultimate form of accountability. When a parent can have the power to say, I'm going to pick something else for my child and the money will follow my child, that is ultimate accountability. That is a very strong incentive for the school, the system, to try to provide what that child needs if the parent can seek a different option. If you're just talking about test-based accountability, I'll tell you my personal opinion is that test-based accountability should be on a spectrum. So the less choice a family has, the stronger the role the state should have. The more choice a family has, the lighter the touch that's necessary from the state, because the parent is able to exercise and make decisions on where and how they want their child to be taught and the money that follows. And so then there's the spectrum. When states have in place compulsory attendance laws that say you shall put your child in school or you shall go to jail, and we're going to tell you where to send your child to school, and the state already knows some or several of the schools that we're making families send their children are not performing very well, are not good learning environments. The state has a big responsibility to ensure that there is learning that is going on. The more that the decision-making shifts to the parents, and every single parent that chooses a private school is choosing that school. They're not being court assigned to that school. They're making a choice. So the parent is making a decision, whether it's on safety, whether it's, because they like the faith-based curriculum, whether it's because they see that their child is going to be engaged in that school, whether they're going to be away from maybe a bullying environment they were in. Parents are making those decisions for a complex set of reasons. And so what we advocate for is to have transparency through norm referenced testing, right? So that there is an academic measure, the information goes to the parent, the information goes to the state or to a third party evaluator. So the program can be evaluated as a whole, but that's the difference, right? If you're going to have schools where 100% of the parents were assigned to that school, the state needs a heavier hand, the state needs a greater role. When you have schools or programs where the parents are making the decisions, the state can have a lighter touch, but still have information about how their child's doing.
I'm going to jump in on a couple of those points. So I think first, there are very few places now where you don't have some choices, even without the voucher programs. Right? So at least 35% of students nationally already don't attend their neighborhood public school. The vast majority, I think pretty much everybody now has homeschooling options, that these are already widespread. So this is part of the point here is like, we're talking about a particular kind of choice. We're talking about private school choice versus all these other kinds of choice that are already out there. So there's not this idea that the government's has a law that you must attend this school.
I think every state has schools that are persistently low performing, and I doubt that.
And there are options.
100% of the parents that are having their kids go to those schools, it's because that's the one that they chose.
But they do have choice. All I'm saying is that they have choices, and there are lots of different ways to provide choices other than a private school. So there are other possibilities here.
Well, let me touch on the politics of this issue just very briefly, and then I've got a couple more questions, and I want to save a few minutes for our audience Q&A. But why is there such a strong partisan divide on private school choice? As I mentioned, Future Ed found that lawmakers in 42 states have proposed legislation in 2023 to create or expand tax-funded programs to help parents cover the cost of private education. The best we can tell, they're all Republicans. Why is this sort of stark divide in political divide on this issue?
I'm happy to jump in. I think there are a lot of education issues that I wish were more bipartisan. Instead of just the handful that we see, like workforce education seems to be pretty bipartisan, college and career pathways seems to be pretty bipartisan, but there are a lot of education issues that right now in the times that we're in, it just seems like if one team's for something, the other team has to be against it. I wish it weren't so, because I will tell you, parents don't, the politics of this, the parents just want a good school for their child. The parents want a safe school for their child. Parents want one that is responsive to them, that a parent wants a school that is going to serve their particular child's individual needs. And I think I mentioned it earlier that numerous public opinion surveys show that choice is very broadly supported and bipartisan among people that I would describe as real people, real moms and dads. It's a pretty bipartisan issue of support.
Senator, do you have a thought on this?
Yes. Besides Republican and Democrat, I have found it to be really urban versus rural. And I think there are a few different reasons for that. I think in urban areas, they probably have a few private schools already, or schools of innovation, like we have in Arkansas, different things like that. So they're used to it. It's not shocking or scary because it's something that they've been experiencing for some time. And in rural areas, I mean, the local school is the community. It's where everyone goes to the Friday night football games, and every teacher in the school system and every kid, teachers know the name of every single kid in that district because there's only maybe a couple hundred between grades K through 12. And so I think there's fear of the unknown, of something that they're not used to, and fear that they may not have enough students in their school district to keep their school district open. And so I think there is quite a bit of that. I know I've experienced that even within my old Senate district. I have a new one now that looks quite different. And so that's a lot of the fear, is just how can our local small district stay alive, which then keeps the community alive. So I think that's a big part of the argument.
Interesting. Doug, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that hasn't gotten raised here is the really kind of hateful speech, and I'm not including the panelists in this, but the right wing of the Republican Party has been saying some really hateful things for a long time now about public schools, calling the teachers groomers, and a Republican presidential candidate saying that Randy Weingarten is the biggest threat to the country. I mean, these things are just, it's absolutely kind of absurd, but I think that ginning up of all this hatred against public schools has the effect then of getting people to think about these kinds of alternatives. So I think, and Patricia's right, that there's, in terms of the polling, it's actually the underlying Democratic Republican support actually isn't all that different between the parties. It's what's happening of the party leadership and the way that the political parties are operating, the strength of the right wing of the party that's turned this into a litmus test.
So let me ask another dimension of this question, which is, what do you all think about the likely impact of these new universal ESAs on traditional public schools? You've talked about that a little bit, Senator, in the context of small rural communities. Very helpful. But more generally, what do you see as the likely impact? And related to that is the question of whether there will be increased supply to meet increased demand, increased supply in the private sector. I'd love thoughts on that. And then it relates to the politics, does it not? Because those who see themselves as advocates of traditional public schools might well see public funding of private schooling as a sort of threat of different sorts to themselves. But talk about that a little bit, that constellation of issues.
Well, I think that over time, I hope that there is, I think that's the hope, that over time we do see more private schools in different parts of the state. Like I said, right now, in my community of a little over 30,000, we've got 2 private schools. And so I think in some places of the state, you can easily have a private school to choose from, but in more rural areas, you may not. And over time, I think that may change. One thing I would love to see change, I have 4 children, 3 are currently in public school, and a 4th one will be in a year from now, and she has Down syndrome. So we'll be looking at the different special education programs in the public schools and trying to make decisions based on that. And I hope that we see over time more schools for children with disabilities that can meet their individualized learning needs, just like we see in Easter Seals in Little Rock. And we see the demand for that in a place like Pulaski County here in Arkansas. And my hope, and to me, quite honestly, that doesn't just only help the student meet their education needs, but it also, I think, helps the public schools who are trying to juggle the needs of so many kids, both in the classroom and maybe in a CBI classroom, which we still have in Arkansas, community-based instruction, and self-contained classrooms. So hopefully over time that will help lighten the load of the public schools in meeting some of those needs, and also help get these kids the educational needs met that they have.
Okay. Others? Liz.
Doug, I think, is speaking actually, but he's on mute. Yeah.
It's one thing to watch out for, I think, going forward is, there's a lot of money being poured into this. And so I think you're likely to see a lot of for-profits come in as they did in the college sector to try to take advantage of that, and that didn't work out very well in the higher ed sector. And that's where a lot of the student debt problems have been. Students going in and getting these kind of meaningless degrees that don't pay off, and then they're saddled with debt and that sort of thing. I can have the debt issue in this case, but I do think you're going to end up with with some actors coming into the system to try to attract students and mostly with a profit motive in ways that are not likely to translate into good outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking something similar. I think, I think we'll see, especially like for some of these rural communities that where maybe there's not enough people to have a private school, that you're going to see more online programs, and the research on online programs is not great. There are some online programs that have done really great things for kids also. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like how we have a broader conversation with parents about what to look for, how to know if your kid is doing well and learning what they should. I also think it's important to have a conversation with parents about the fact that there are also trade-offs to moving your kids, right? We don't want to enter a world where you're sending your kid to school A this year, but then you don't like it and you go to school B. I mean, most parents aren't doing that, but we do see in DC, we see this with a pretty active charter system. There's a lot of moving around, and the research shows that's not great for kids' long-term outcomes. I think there is a lot of money, like Doug said. I'd say, look, but maybe, I don't know if it's ironic or what it is, but in Arizona, if you have most of the kids in the program right now who were never in public school, yeah, the state's now on the hook for that money, and they got to talk about where that money is going to come from in the long run. It's also true that the public schools aren't actually losing money for those kids because those kids were never enrolled there, so they were never getting some kind of per pupil funding that they're now losing. But I think there's a longer term sort of downstream economic question about how the state pays for this over time. And kind of what that means. So I guess I still am on my get more information to parents.
Well, actually, on that same point, just to jump in, the states are in a flush situation right now, generally speaking, with their finances, and that's not going to last for very long. But I think that's another reason why you're seeing this happen now, is because the budgets they're flush with money and they've got extra money to spend, and so now there's a place to put it. But 5 or 10 years down the road, when times are not so good, there's going to be a little bit of a reckoning, I think, on school spending.
I think it's also, Patricia, I'll come to you in just a second. I think it's also worth pointing out that under most of these universal programs, families can spend money on educational resources or educational programming that is not delivered in the form of schools alone. So you can buy tutoring, you can buy different sorts of educational technology, et cetera. And that creates a sort of different set of questions, both for the impact of these programs on public schooling and also on the accountability, transparency front, et cetera.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Patricia.
Go ahead, Patricia.
Let Patricia jump in.
Yeah, I think one thing is to look at Florida. So Florida has had private school choice to, really big numbers of students for 24 years. And so in 2001, I think is when we passed the statewide voucher for students with special needs, right? And even though every single student who had an individual education plan was eligible, there were about 5 to 7% of students that picked a private school option. But if you look over time, there were more schools, just like the senator described or said that she hopes will occur in Arkansas, that came to serve students with autism, came and were started specifically to serve students with special needs. Over time, you can see in Florida, with more and more families being eligible, that not only did funding increase to the traditional public school system, but more families got options and more opportunities did spring up. Tom, what you were just saying about, the ability of a parent to be able to use this for other types of, tutoring or therapy or other services, I think we are going to see with an ESA, which is different than a traditional voucher, you are going to see more micro schools. You're going to see more schools that, or educational services that offer something for a parent, even though now you have parents who may want to do part of the instruction at home and really curate a different set of opportunities for their kids. I hope that, the conversation here is still, it's this kind of, do we fund the system or do we fund the student? And in other countries like the Netherlands, you start with, you fund the student, and then the families pick a traditional what we would call a public school or a private school or a faith-based school. We are moving in these states that are offering universal choice or universal education savings accounts, hopefully to more pluralistic model, one where many other schools and services spring up to serve the needs of students. There are more innovative providers, more Montessori schools, more micro schools, more Great Hearts Academies, for example, that decide to try a private school model. They're a traditional charter school. So I think we will see innovation. And if states implement well, there will be hiccups. There are hiccups in every major program that gets out there. But the more that families have opportunities and states are faithful in implementation, I think you're going to see a win-win for the schools and the systems and the families.
Great, thank you. So we have time for about one more question, and the good news is that your answers have responded or answered many of the questions in the chat. So thank you for that. But I did want to close with Senator Davis, since we started with her, and ask her what is a tough question, but one that's come up. I'm reading it. I've read it several times here, and that is, what's the public good? We've talked again about public versus private motivations here and incentives and benefits, but what's the public good? This audience member asks, that is served by opening private school choice programs to wealthy families that already have children enrolled in private schools. But we can take off the last half of that, since we already talked about it a little bit. But traditionally, the private school choice programs have, as you've been saying, as a group, been targeted at low-income students in failing traditional public schools, and those with special needs. What is the public good, Senator, of expanding beyond those targeted goals?
Well, I think if you look at the statistic again, that about 35% of our kids are reading at or above grade level. If you dig into that statistic, it's not just poor kids. It's not just kids with disabilities. It's kids across the spectrum that fall into all categories. And so I think when we're talking about education, the first question and mostly only question, I won't say exclusively, but that we should be asking is, how is this good for the student? And that's what we need to be focused on answering, because all the other things fall into place. And so when you're talking about the public good, if kids can read, like we know, they're learning to read in K through 3, and then 4 through 12, they're reading to learn and onward. And so we know that if we're teaching kids to read and ensuring that they can read on grade level, then they're learning from there on out. And that just, you see that pipeline of third grade to prison. And we know that it's pretty stark, kids not being able to read on grade level. So we want to close that gap and make sure that kids have an opportunity for jobs, whether it's going on to higher ed, whether it's going straight into the career field or whatever it is. But first and foremost, we should be asking, is this good for the student? And that's why, like I said earlier, that universal choice, it's not the ticket, the one thing that fixes all of our education woes. It's all the things that come with it. And, talking about 90% of students think that, 90% of parents think that their kids are reading on grade level. They have no idea. That's a huge part. Literacy is a huge part at K through 3rd grade in LEARNs, that starting in kindergarten within 30 days, they're going to start assessments, 3 assessments a year that will tell parents, be sent home to parents and say, your child is not on track to pass 3rd grade because they're not on track to read on grade level. And starting at a young age in kindergarten to wrap around support services, to provide high impact tutoring grants of up to $500 for parents and families to get their kids in tutoring, providing literacy coaches, 120 literacy coaches across the state, to provide merit pay for teachers who are performing high student growth or high impact student growth with their kids. The list goes on, is my point. And it's not just that a universal school choice is the answer, but it's all these things with it that are going to take all of our kids and help them to read at grade level and go on to live a successful life.
Well said. I'm going to ask you one sort of footnote question that on behalf of the audience member who says, well, essentially in those circumstances, why don't we means test the private school support because families with resources can already pay for the tutoring and other valuable external educational resources you mentioned.
So the question is, why are we opening it to everyone? Is that what you're?
Yeah, and not means testing it based on families' resources.
I see. Well, we just have it universal, so anyone that wants to apply can. And I think what we've seen in other states is that not necessarily wealthy families are going for it. I think we saw the same thing to be true with like Easter Seals, for example. There was a need, and parents who couldn't afford it were not able to get that education for their kids, and now they are. So it's something that we believe is important. Like I said, students are falling into all categories, not being able to read, being able to read regardless of their family's income. And so providing universal choice for students across the state was important. It was an important initiative for our governor, like I said, not just to provide universal school choice, but to also help support and heavily invest in our public schools. And that's exactly what she's done. It's what Secretary Oliva is helping roll out, and so far doing a great job at that, and something that we support at in the legislature.
Great. Thank you so much for taking so much time to be with us. And thank you to all of the panelists for really thoughtful, engaging conversation on a complicated, sometimes controversial issue. It gives me hope that we can be thoughtful and sort of rational about this stuff on these issues as we move forward. So thank you all very much. We will have a recording of this conversation on our website in the next day or two, and we'll look forward to continuing to learn from all of you on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.